We had a summit in China, SCO summit, which was huge in India, Russia, China coming together. And we had regional powers, we had Iran and other Central Asian powers there talking to these superpowers. On the other hand, we had Armenia and Azerbaijan being part of that, considering the new conflicts in that region. Curious what Donald Trump and how Donald Trump reacted, and he's talking about the United States.
United States, everything in the world would die. It's true. It's so powerful. It's so big, and I made it really big in the first 4 years. Then it started to degenerate with what this Biden administration did. But we've built it up to a level that I never thought we could be at this quickly. We're the hottest. We're the best financially. The money coming in is so big because of tariffs and other things, but because of tariffs. Tariff gets us even those other things. Plus, it gets us great negotiators. I settled 7 wars, and numerous of those wars were because of trade.
By the way, tariffs was the main reason that India was somehow pushed toward Russia and China in the summit. After years, India went to the summit, the SCO summit. Go ahead, Michael, your take.
Well, the interesting thing is that there's been hardly any coverage in the American press and even the European press about what the summit really was all about. The New York Times coverage was probably the worst. It made it seem as if the whole Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the meetings in Tianjin and Beijing were simply to discuss confrontation against the West. And to read the coverage here and in the Financial Times and others, you'd think that the meetings all were, how do we organize ourselves to threaten the West? That's all the coverage is about. The military parade, which is depicted as a imminent threat to the West. What's left out is the fact that all of this focus on the military parade was to remind the world the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II in Asia, and it was to frame the whole discussions that the aim originally of the post-war economic order that the Americans strategists designed was to end fascism and introduce a fair and fair world order based on the United Nations principles. Again and again, both President Xi, President Putin, and others kept referring to the United Nations principles of equal treatment, no interference in other countries. It was about how to reestablish this order. And of course, they recognized that this order cannot any longer include the West. Putin's speech especially was how the United States and Europe have led the West away from the United Nations principles, away from the open international economy, away from the most favored nations treatment where you treat other nations equal and you acknowledge the security demands of everyone. So you had the NATO head, Mark Rutte, complaining that Putin was getting too much attention, meaning we shouldn't discuss, even what they're really talking about in China. It meant not to discuss how much of a landmark we've seen the last few days in introducing a new economic order. And President Putin, when told about this, explained that the press conference he gave one, the confrontation was not at all the focus. The talks were about how to spell out the details of consolidating relations among the Asian countries, the BRICS countries, and the Global South countries themselves. There was no mention in the speeches that were given and the press conferences really about the West. It was about themselves. And specifically, how are Asia and the Global South countries to go their own way with minimum contact and exposure to the West? They're not trying to attack the West. They're trying to isolate themselves and break free of the Western economic model of Margaret Thatcherism, financialization, neoliberalism that's led the West to deindustrialize. How can the members of the SCO, BRICS, and their allies in the global South, how can they create a socialist market economy, basically along the similar lines to China, that actually raise living standards and increase productivity instead of deindustrializing? So no wars really threatened except by NATO, but there's not going to be peaceful relations either. The idea is how to become independent of relations with the West, and this is what's not being discussed here. And this split is best epitomized by the power of Siberia to pipeline. That was the most important discussion that came out. And this was gas that originally was planned to go to Europe via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Well, that's all ended. This Siberian gas is going to go via Mongolia to China. And just as it powered Russian gas powered European industry in the past, it's now going to do the same for China, Mongolia, and other countries that are plugged into their mutual pipeline. Well, what that means is that Europe is going to be left to depend on US liquefied natural gas exports, much higher prices, and declining North Sea supplies from Norway. And the gas, this enormous amount of gas in Siberia is going to drive Chinese growth. Well, yes, you could see the fury that this has caused in Europe. Yesterday afternoon, the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, called Putin perhaps the most serious war criminal of our time. What he said, the European Union is rapidly transforming from an economic union it's into a military political bloc with almost, he gave almost constant aggressive decisions and statements, and that's how President Putin described what Merz said, that the Western reports are simply belligerent. And Putin said, we do not assume that any new dominant states should appear. Everyone's going to be on an equal footing. In other words, no new dominant state means we're not going to let the United States and its satellites in Europe run the world anymore, certainly not run us. But there's a recognition that, yes, the United States can run Europe and probably Japan and Korea for the time being, but all these meetings were, how do we not get involved in that? And you quoted President Trump before. He, on social media, he wrote, President Xi, please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America. That was how the message of the reporting of all of this has happened. And I don't want to go on too long, but I just want to point out that the contrast between the successful consolidation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS trade and investment, it stands, it's a different economic system from the U.S. destabilization, U.S. economy that's destabilizing. And that makes it very difficult for the upshot of the meetings. For, I guess, what we can discuss is if the world's dividing into these two different systems, how is this going to affect countries that have tried to have a foot in both systems, like Turkey? Well, originally people thought that India was going to be the weak part of BRICS, and that India was trying to have one foot in the U.S. economy and the other foot as much as it could with BRICS, but really representing U.S. neoliberal interests within BRICS. Trump's tariffs changed all of that. Fortuitously, just a week before the meeting, Trump gave India no choice at all but to choose its future with BRICS and to make up with China and say this borderland up in the Himalayas where there's no real defined border, that's not important at all. What is important is our whole long-term development. And for India, the oil and gas trade that we have with Russia, refining Russian oil, and getting it, is much more important to our economy, which runs on energy and electricity that is produced by oil. That's much more important than our exports, mainly of manual labor products, to the United States. Well, Putin kept saying India needs the U.S. market. It's going to fall apart without the U.S. market. And I think President Modi made it very clear that that's not the case at all. So you have these two opposing dynamics at work. On the one hand, the BRICS and the global majority are trying to isolate themselves from the U.S. NATO, not to attack it, not to be rivals, no rivalry involved, because they're doing completely different things. Europe is militarizing its economy and deindustrializing the non-industrial sector. Asia does have to have a military overhead, but it's trying to continue to spread the Chinese successful industrial model to all of the other countries of BRICS, and to arrange these treaties that they're working on accordingly to consolidate their mutual relationships. And that's what is so upsetting to the West, the thought that other countries are not dependent on the US market, not dependent on Europe, but can actually go their own way. And it's a different system, and it's succeeding while the US economy is shrinking and the European economy is shrinking, and they are disintegrating.
Go ahead, Richard.
Yes, I'd like to add to what Michael has said, with a little bit of history and then a little bit of focus on the BRICS. At the end of World War II, George Kennan and others argued that in the wake of the defeat of fascism, the next stage would have to be for the consolidation of the American empire. He did not use that language, but in effect would be to isolate, or in his words, contain the Soviet Union, which then, in his brain, included Eastern Europe. Okay. Why do I bring this up? Because history has brought us to a kind of 180 degrees. If I had to summarize what I got out of this summit in China over the last weekend, it would be that it represents a program of the containment of the West, and above all, the United States. Again, not in those words, because they go out of their way, it seems to me, not to use the language, because language matters. They don't define themselves as caught up in a great military confrontation. They don't describe themselves as the object of a great conspiracy. They don't do that. You might enjoy, as I did, what Mr. Putin said when he was shown the clip you just showed us, Nima, about, my greetings as you conspire against the United States. When asked what he thought of that, Mr. Putin had a big grin and said how he appreciated Donald Trump's sense of humor. What a remarkable way to diffuse, by humor, by ridicule, the intensity of it all, the hothouse language now becomes a joke. It tells you a lot about what's going on here. Number one. Number two, the BRICS now is in a very comfortable position. And that's what this summit showed to me. For 5 years, since 2020 to right now, the gap between the size and economic wealth of the BRICS relative to that of the United States or the G7 has gotten wider and wider and wider. This is stunningly important. They caught up in the year 2020, and they are now leaving us in their rear view mirror as they move forward. That's why Michael's point is so important. Their major function now is to consolidate, to organize, to integrate what they already have, which I want to remind you, the BRICS together is more than half the population of this planet. And the G7 is barely 10% of this planet. And those numbers are very, very hard to overcome. And if you add the 5 years in which one of them grows markedly faster than the other one, I want to remind you, Germany is in recession. Britain is barely holding on. The United States feels better than all of them because it has 2.5%. China has 5% and India has 7%. There is no contest here. Time has been on their side and only becomes more so as I speak. And that's what they were dealing with. They know that. The United States people know it too. Everybody knows it. But that means they don't need and they don't want military confrontation. And they don't want it because they don't need it. Whereas the West wants it because it needs it. You have to keep that in mind, or else you'll misunderstand the dynamic that's going on here. And I think at the bottom here is a very, very dangerous situation. And let me end my comments with that. The United States maintains 700, roughly, military bases around the world. Russia and China have nothing like that. China lists 1, and I don't know what the Russians list, but it's trivial. Okay, what does that mean? Well, let me give you a second example. Over the time of the meetings in Beijing, the one dramatic thing that the United States did and made sure that the president announced was an extraordinary act. A boat, a little boat with a few outboard motors, was moving in waters 1,000 miles away from the United States. It was clear from the pictures that we've now been shown that this boat had no missiles on it. It couldn't have sustained them. It was too small. It was moving in the water between Venezuela and Trinidad, which is a short distance. Those countries are separated by 10 or 12 miles of water. And the United States took the extraordinary step, since you can't know what's on such a boat without pretty close inspection, it did not stop the boat. It did not arrest the people in the boat. It blew up the boat with either a drone or a missile, killing, according to the US government, 11 people who were in or on that boat. That is the United States, and this was announced by the president in his press conference. It was announced without arrest, without a trial, without a jury, without a judgment, and these people were summarily executed. What are you doing? By the way, these are international waters where global international law forbids this. The United States is not at war with Venezuela, or if they are, no one has declared it. Not the Venezuelans, not the Americans. Congress hasn't voted for it, and the president hasn't said it. He announced that we, whoever the royal we was, took out a drug boat as if he knows 1,000 miles away what was in that boat and where the people in the boat were going with what was in the boat. Since it's 1,000 miles away, since there are many countries between that place and the United States, that boat could have been going to any of them with God knows what in it. What are you doing? That is so outrageous an act, and will be seen around the world in that way, that you have to ask, what would possess you to do it? And what would possess you to have your president tell the world you're doing it? And the only answer I can come up with is that it is very important in the short run to take the headlines away from the Epstein case, which threatens Mr. Trump. And in the long run, it's an underscoring that military action is what we are reduced to. And now finally, in Afghanistan, the United States began, if I understand it correctly, to use drones. And very famously, over a number of years, listened to whatever its sources of information were, and used the drones to assassinate groups of people who often turned out to be a funeral, a wedding, a family gathering. Okay, if you keep doing that, and that's the equivalent of what was done with that boat, you are teaching the people of whoever you do that to be deeply angry, bitter, and fearful. Because to them, this is wildly irrational military destruction. If you want to know, honestly, why the war in Afghanistan, which pitted the United States against the Taliban, was lost by the United States, because what runs Afghanistan today, friends, is the Taliban. They won, we lost. And one of the reasons was what we did there, and we seem not to have learned the lesson. All of Latin America can now sit and wonder, can you send a boat with anything, anywhere in the Caribbean Sea, for example, or are you risking the displeasure of the United States, which is willing to be jury, judge, prosecutor, and executioner all at once, instantaneously, when there is obviously no imminent threat to any American anywhere? This is We're watching something which in itself is small, but put into its context is not small. It is a dangerous sign of a reliance on military action because nothing else any longer works to deal with your problem. India is lost to us. The president who suggests that he is a great leader because of his tariffs, just as we watch the BRICS organizing itself to enable dozens of countries to reduce or eliminate the damage they feel the tariffs have done to them. 50 billion or 100 billion raised by the tariffs is a childishly inadequate offset to the damage done by what India has done, and finally, what every country on earth is now doing. Every business involved in international trade is now doing. They are reassessing. And by the way, that includes American companies, both those located with plants abroad and those here in the United States. Practical profit maximizing strategy requires you to adjust to a dramatically changing world economy. The rest of the world has not, in most cases, imposed tariffs on the United States, but they could. And if the evolution develops in certain directions, they will. And where you locate your business, who you trade with, who you buy from, who you sell to, everyone is recalculating. And in that recalculation, the relative importance of the West is shrinking, and the relative importance of the people who met in Beijing is growing. And the only people who will ignore that are those who are self-destructive rather than profit maximizing as they claim to be. So we are watching a changing world economy, and we're watching a meeting in Beijing that will be looked back on as a very important milestone. Mr. Trump has accelerated these changes. That's all.
Michael,
I want to pick up the point that you were making about the attack on Venezuela, the boat. President Trump provided the framework for why he did it. What he said was explicitly, this is only the first attack on Venezuela. It's the opening shot. And there's been a discussion, as you know, for the last few weeks about the U.S. plans to invade Venezuela, because indeed it does have a threat to the United States. And you have to understand what that threat is. The threat is Venezuela has oil that is no longer directly controlled by the United States. Control of the world oil supply, at least control of the oil supply to the Western satellite countries, is a key to American diplomatic control of their economies, because it's this control by the Eight Sisters, the big American, British, and Dutch oil companies together, that enables the United States to impose sanctions to say, if your country does not do what we want, for instance, if your country does not break off your trade and investment relations with Russia, we're going to cut off your oil. So I think you have to put the Venezuelan attack in the same context as the American destruction of Nord Stream. The United States has already said, Trump has put a $50 million bounty on whoever can kill Venezuela's President Maduro. This is not exactly the UN Charter's rule about not interfering with the internal affairs of other countries. The United States has already grabbed Venezuela's assets. Its gold assets that were held in the Bank of England have been grabbed. The United States has grabbed Venezuela's holdings of distribution and gas station networks in the United States. The United States wants Venezuelan oil because it's an enormous amount of oil. And the United States has aimed at controlling this oil for the last century. That's why its refineries are not in Venezuela, but in Trinidad, because that's separate from Venezuela. The United States has always wanted the ability to put pressure on Venezuela by saying, well, you may have the oil, but who's going to refine it? Well, here you're 12 miles away on Trinidad. Well, that's very separate, and we can control Trinidad and just have our control over you. Think of the imminent attack on Venezuela in the same frame of reference that Trump has said we must invade Greenland for our own national security. For Trump, and Greenland has raw materials that the United States wants. It has favorable situation geopolitically in the north to control a large part of the sea trade and the whole Arctic arena. This is what it's all about. The United States wants to actually invade Venezuela, and it apparently has been preparing marine forces for an invasion. We don't know how many. There are various rumors and reports around, but enough reports to say that the plans are all there. And when Trump says this is only the first step,